Hi, everybody. Hope that you are well. What I'd like to do here is walk through a little bit of an overview of the structure of American education law. The goal really is to make sure that we're all on the same page when we start identifying decision makers, lines of authority, etc., with as we discuss the cases and the legislation that we are going to encounter throughout the semester. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about who has authority and power in the American education sphere. And so the goal here is to just give us all a common understanding for that so that we, as we start to think through proposed strategies and solutions or see and evaluate the strategies and solutions that are attempted through litigation or legislation, we understand sort of how that fits. This overview is focusing on primary and secondary education, so kindergarten through 12th grade. The higher education universe in American education is a little bit different, but perhaps more straightforward. And so a little easier, I think, to understand as we encounter higher ed cases, which won't be the majority. Most of our cases will be K-12. We might take some time to do some overview in higher education as well. So I'm going to share the screen just to get us, give a sort of some version of a lecture here of that will help us get on the same page on this topic. So I just want to begin with identifying the various levels at which decisions get made in American education. And I'm going to start at the sort of narrowest, the smallest on the ground level, and then we're going to work our way up to the biggest levels. And the on the ground levels happen in the school itself or even in the classroom itself. And so I want to begin our overview with the players being the students, the teachers, and the principal. Okay, so these are the main decision makers, the main individuals that have power in the education system at the school level. And basically the students, I think we all can relate to what being a student entails and the control that you have as a student. You have very little control over much other than how much effort you put in to your studies. You don't get, and maybe some level of authority to decide which classes you take within your school as you get into high school. But beyond that, the student's power in terms and authority in terms of making decisions about education policy is very limited. The teachers have some more significant power within their classrooms, right? So they are the primary individual with authority in the classroom. So classroom management is going to fall in the purview of the teachers. Some level, the teachers have control over what to teach and certainly over how to teach it. But a lot of the curriculum and content is dictated to teachers. Assignments of which classes or courses to teach is often outside of the control of teachers. And certainly, as we discussed in our conversation on Friday, resources, the resources that are provided to a school is really largely outside of the authority of teachers. They are sort of sent to manage classrooms with the resources that are at their disposal. Principals, sort of the equivalent of the teacher, but at the school level, they might make decisions about who teaches what, about what courses get taught in a particular school. And so the principal has significant authority, but significant authority only in their school. Similarly, a teacher has significant authority, but authority only in their classrooms. And so it's important to sort of recognize where the limitations are. The principals also have very little control over the amount of funding that they have or the amount of resources that they have. They do often have the ability to make hiring decisions, although those might be influenced by contracts with teacher unions that exist at the district level, and so sort of outside of the full authority of the principal. So that's what happens at the school level, and I think most people can relate to how authority is shared or how governance happens at the school level. There's obviously a lot of other actors. There's staff, there's parents, there's parent organizations, there might be alumni or boosters or other sorts of players in, that are operating at the school level, but these are the primary decision makers when it comes to the school. To take a step up from a school, and again, I'm focusing here on public K-12 education. The next step up is typically the school district, okay? And the school district has a superintendent and a governing board, okay? And so these two entities are the primary decision makers at the district level. And districts can be made up of anywhere, from 5 to 200 schools. So districts vary in size. They vary in budgets. They vary in a lot of different ways. They might have, less than 2,000 students, or they might have 200,000 students. So school districts all look very different, but largely they have very similar setups. The setup being that the superintendent oversees the operations of the school district with plenty of staff as well, and working with the principals and teachers in the schools. And then there's an elected school board that hires the superintendent and has ultimate control of the budget. So the superintendent is making decisions like what principals are assigned to what schools. So just like the principal might assign teachers, the superintendent, or at least the staff of the superintendent, will make decisions about principals. Then a lot of employment decisions, a lot of policy decisions, curricular options, which schools should offer which specialized curricula, for example, those might be superintendent vision kind of things. The school board, the elected school board, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I'll talk about that in just a second, the elected part of elected school board. Their primary goals or their primary authorities are to oversee the superintendent. That means they have hiring and firing ability when it comes to the superintendent, and they have control of the budget. Now, some school districts have the authority to tax and therefore raise funds for their school district's budget. Others, and this is the case here in Tennessee, the school districts, the school boards and the districts themselves do not have independent taxing authority. So for example, in many counties where there is only one school district in Tennessee, the county commission or some version of the county government is the fiscal agent that would be the one responsible for setting and collecting taxes that will then be passed through the county government to the school district. We're going to talk about funding it in just a few minutes. And so that's the norm here in Tennessee. In some other states, some other places, school districts themselves are able to set those taxes themselves. Here in Shelby County, the county commission sets countywide taxes, collects it, and then distributes it to the 7 different school districts that exist in our county. And so within Tennessee, any county that has multiple school districts, that's typically the way it's done. There are a couple of exceptions, not really worth going into much detail about. The thing I wanted to come back to is the elected nature of the school board. So the school board is elected just among the voters within the jurisdiction that the school board's authority, where those borders are. So one thing that's, we're focusing right now on a single school district, but obviously there are many school districts. Here in Shelby County, for example, we have 7 school districts. Each school district is responsible for a specific geographic area and is wholly responsible for the public education within that geographic area, with a few exceptions that we'll get to later in the semester, and completely not responsible for any of the education that's happening outside of those boundaries. And so sometimes this is framed as what's called school district sovereignty, that each school district, even though they might be connected to a broader statewide system of schools, is actually sovereign in its own universe, in its own jurisdiction. And part of that sovereignty connects back to the idea of elected school boards, that the school district is governed by a board that is democratically responsible to the constituents. Note that the constituents are the voters of the school district, not the parents, not the teachers, not the students of the school district, but anybody who is a voter in the school district, because they're dealing with a significant amount of public funding that they get. There are some districts around the country that have a little bit of a different model. They might have a school, instead of a school board, they might be controlled by the mayor of a city. So this happens from time to time. And the mayor might appoint a board. They might be, in other circumstances, they might have been taken over by the State Department of Education. This, as was alluded to on Friday, actually has happened in Detroit, where the state sort of took over the school district in an alleged sort of need crisis mode. And so in those instances, the elected school board doesn't really operate as they do in a traditional school district. Those are all more modern and contemporary, last 20, 25 years developments in changing governance. And so we'll talk about them a little bit later in the semester. I want you to sort of just be aware that they exist. But for the most part, most school districts we're dealing with are going to be governed by an elected school board that's responsible to the voters within the geographic boundaries of the school district. Like I said, there's a lot of school districts within each state, within each sort of jurisdiction. And so as we sort of go on up in the process, there's state level decision makers. Let me just go back real quick. One more thing on the school board. The school board, takes in the money from all of the different places and has ultimate control on spending. So the superintendent might have a vision for how to operate the school district, but to the extent that that vision involves reallocation of funds, the school board generally has oversight over all budgetary decision making. So whether that's pay for teachers, or whether that's construction of a new school, or whether that's whether to take out a loan, in the moment of pandemic to pay for new technology within schools, or any kind of decisions like that. Those are school board level decisions. But the school board isn't unrestrained. They answer ultimately up the chain to state government. And there's two primary actors within the state government that affect and oversee schooling and have authority over schooling. One is a State Department of Education, okay, which is maybe a regulatory body that is overseeing the performance of schools and school districts within the state. And the other is as a sort of pass-through. Another role that the State Department of Education plays is sort of as a pass-through for funding, right? So for funding from the state government. The state government itself has a role to play. This is, just sort of our branches of government. I should have included the judiciary branch, the judicial branch, because courts do have authority over schools, but in the more typical litigation context. The governor, the executive, and the legislative branch are making laws that might affect schooling, directly, affirmative laws, as opposed to a judicial system, which is dealing only with the cases that come to it. So the State Department of Education does implementation, right? So they have the law as written. They might write some regulations to sort of build out in more detail the state laws that exist. They are the ones that are going to be doing the year-to-year or month-to-month accountability and oversight of districts and schools. They're going to be the primary liaison between the schools of a particular state and any interactions that those schools might have with the federal government, which we'll talk about the federal government's role here in a moment. And as I mentioned earlier, distributor of state funding. That state funding is set by state law. And so the state government in our state and in other states has formulas that determine how much funding goes to particular schools. But in addition, the state government might pass all sorts of other laws that influence what happens all the way over here in the school itself. So teacher qualification might be set by state law. Graduation requirements might be set by state law. Curricular limitations or decisions might be set by state law. When a school district is taken away from the authority of the school board, that might be set by state law. So there's a significant role to play for the state government in oversight. I mentioned a little bit last week that police power gives the state the authority to operate these schools, right? And they do in fact operate these schools. And some areas of operation, states pass really specific laws, like you need this many English credits and this many math credits and this many American government credits, etc., to graduate from high school in our state. Other things they might leave to the State Department of Education to fill out. So they might say things like there must be 180 or however many days of school, but the State Department of Education might fill that out and say those days have to happen between this date and this date, or the number of hours that must, that the schools must be in session in order to qualify for as a school day have to be X number. Okay, so the State Department of Education, as many regulatory agencies when we're talking about administrative law, sets binding regulations that apply to the districts and to the schools themselves. Okay, so this is kind of like the broad overview of decision makers in the chain. I want to highlight a couple of specific things that I suspect y'all would have questions about. One is, what about charter schools? What are charter schools? Okay, and so charter schools are schools like any other. So they have, like every other school, students, teachers, principal. Okay, charter schools are public. They are operated with public funding. They must abide by most state laws. They cannot charge tuition, but they are operated privately. Okay, so this is what makes a distinction between a charter school and a traditional public school, is that instead of the school board and then superintendent and then principal, that line of authority, there is a charter between sometimes a school board, that's probably most often, but other times a State Department of Education, in which they sort of subcontract out. They say, look, there's this building and we would like to run schools in this building, or maybe they don't even say there's a building. Maybe the charter operator says, we would like to serve students in this way. Here is our proposal for how we're going to serve the students. Can we have a charter, permission to operate a public school in your jurisdiction? So like I said, most of the time, what that looks like is the school board granting a charter to the charter school board. The charter school board is unelected. They're appointed. Some of you might even be on charter school boards. They are private citizens, unelected, appointed, who have governing authority over just that charter school. So if we're speaking over here that a school district has jurisdiction and sovereignty, pretty much complete autonomy within its boundaries, right? Complete autonomy is too much. Significant autonomy within its boundaries. So too, the charter school operates with a similar amount of autonomy, but just within the four corners of a particular school. There are some instances in which, quite a few actually, in which charter schools operate as part of a network of charter schools. So you might have heard of KIPP, K-I-P-P, for example. This is a network of charter schools. And so there might be a charter school board, an unelected charter school board that oversees more than one of these charter schools. But that's just a difference in scale. That's not really a difference in governance and operation. The similar kinds of decisions that would be made by a school district, a superintendent, and elected board are the kinds of decisions that are going to be made by the charter school executive director and board. Just unelected less democratically accountable individuals. But the charter schools don't operate completely independently of the public system. They are public schools and they do get public funding. And so I've drawn these dotted lines to sort of signify the not just the where does the charter school get its authority to operate schools, but also what are some of the legal relationships and authority relationships that exist between charter schools and the public institutions like a school district or a state department of education. So we've mentioned already the charter to operate, but in addition, charter schools are held accountable in significant ways so that if they aren't performing as anticipated or as charter, they might actually lose their charter and be put out of business. This happens from time to time. And so the school board or the State Department of Education, or sometimes both, will have oversight over charter schools, will take in the charter school annual reports, et cetera, will provide reports about charter school performance to the public. And so this is all forms of accountability that exist between charter schools and the sort of public institutions. I've also already mentioned funding, that the funding is going to be funneled through a school district or straight from the State Department of Education to the charter schools. Private schools similarly are overseen by a State Department of Education. In order to, this connects back to our discussion on Pierce, in order to qualify for satisfying the state's compulsory education requirements, private schools, and I could extend this to homeschool operations, must be accredited and overseen in some way by the State Department of Education. So I couldn't just say, okay, I'm going to homeschool my kids and be done with it. I would have to be in some sort of communication with the State Department of Education or with a homeschool conglomerate that was in communication with the State Department of Education to make sure that what was happening in my homeschool was accredited. Same exact situation for private schools. In order to qualify as something that satisfies the requirement of compulsory education, private schools must submit some reports, mostly financial reports and reports on mission to get accredited by a State Department of Education. So there is still some oversight. It is not, certainly not nearly the level of oversight that you would see in the public system, including charter schools, but there is some tangential relationship between private schools, which are operated, similarly in some ways, set up similarly in some ways to charter schools. There is still a connection between private schools and government. And we saw that the government might have the ability to prohibit certain teaching even in private schools as part of its accreditation process. So this is normally where I would pause. And so if you'd like to pause and jot down a question or two, please do. The goal here is for you guys to hear this lecture and come ready with questions. And so I'm hopeful that you will have plenty of questions, and I'm just going to assume some level that you guys have gotten through the overview and just have specific questions that I can address when we all come back together. But I suspect that many of their questions might be related to funding. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here before I close talking about how schools are funded, how public schools are funded. Private schools largely funded through tuition, charter schools a little bit different from what I'm about to present, but still somewhat similar to traditional public school model. So where does the money come from? So one place that money comes from for all public schools is from states. And we're going to have a few different cases over the course of this semester about funding schemes that states have adopted. States have various formulas. Our Tennessee formula is currently in litigation for maybe the fourth or fifth time. And this is fairly common, right? There's a constitution that says the state will provide schools, and then there's litigation about whether or not the resources that are being provided to those schools are sufficient to satisfy the constitutional mandate that there be schools. And so this litigation often goes back and forth. I will say over time, states have increased the amounts that they spend in school, both in terms of dollar amounts and in terms of the percentage of a school district or a school's budget that comes from the state government has increased substantially, to the point now where in Tennessee and Shelby County in particular, approximately 50% of school funding comes via the state government. So that's state government that might have collected that money in all sorts of different ways, whether it's through sales tax or wheel tax or other sorts of fees that are collected over, statewide, pulled together. And then there's a formula that says, okay, your school district has X number of students. The demographics, like usually socioeconomic demographics, are this, and the number of students with disabilities is this, and the number of students for whom English is not a first language is this. And so they have a formula, and they say, okay, that means you need this many teachers, this many principals, and ultimately this much money. The formula usually says the state will provide X percent of that funding, and the locality is responsible for coming up with the balance. The school district, is responsible for coming up with the balance. But it's very formulaic, and it depends largely on the number of students and some of the characteristics of the students, basically socioeconomic status, disability status, and English language learning status. The local government, by state law, is required to contribute towards whatever the state law mandated amount is for a school district. And so local governments contribute to school districts through largely property taxes. Okay, so this is a city tax or a county tax, property tax. A significant portion of the county budget goes towards schools. And so ultimately what happens here is that all of this money, the state pulls all its money and sends it to its, 100 school districts. The locality, like say Shelby County, collects its property tax money and distributes it to its 7 school districts. And each school district, or if there's only one in a county, then to that county's school district. And then each school district has authority to spend as needed, consistent with state law. And so the two primary sources here are the state government, which is through any combination of taxes, and the local government, which is through property taxes. Now, one quick point here. In Shelby County and in Tennessee more broadly, when there are multiple school districts in a county, the way that it happens is that the county government collects from all of the property taxes in the county and then distributes to all of the school districts based on the number of students. So let's imagine a county that had 2 school districts instead of 7, because it gets a little bit complicated with 7 school districts. And let's say 2/3 of the students go to school district A and 1/3 of the students go to school district B. So if that county raises $1 billion through property taxes, well, 2/3 of that billion, because 2/3 of the students are in school district A, 2/3 of that billion is going to go to school district A, and 1/3, because 1/3 of the students are in school district B, of the billion is going to go, 1/3 is going to go to school district B. Okay, so that means that within Shelby County and within all the counties in Tennessee, the property funding base is consistent within a county. Okay, so oftentimes people look at Shelby County and say, oh, well, in Germantown or Collierville, the property values are much higher, and therefore their funding through property taxes must be much higher. And in fact, that isn't entirely true, right? From the county government, the money is distributed simply based on numbers, okay? And so the county contributes as much to Shelby County schools as it does to Germantown or Collierville schools, even though those are separate school districts. In other jurisdictions, other states, there is no county-wide property tax. When the school board or the school district is the taxing authority, then the only property taxes that go towards local property taxes that go towards funding that particular school district come from the boundaries, within the boundaries of that particular school district. So just note that different jurisdictions, all jurisdictions do it in different ways, but those are the two primary ways in which it's done. One, like we do in Tennessee, where the county government collects from throughout the county and distributes to the school districts of the county, where maybe the boundaries between school districts don't matter quite as much, though they still very much matter. And then other places where each school district is sovereign, not only in governance and in which students attend which schools, but also in terms of local fundraising. So in a jurisdiction like that, the fact that Collierville's property values are net higher per capita than Memphis would make a huge difference. Okay, that's kind of mitigated the way that we do it in Tennessee, but in those kinds of jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions exist largely in the Midwest and Northeast. In those kinds of jurisdictions, you see smaller school districts, each district with sovereignty and taxing authority, and then you see more significant disparities between, adjacent school districts in terms of resources available. Okay, we do have disparities, but they're not as significant because of our system of funding, because our county is our primary local funding source. So if 50% comes from the state and roughly 40% comes from local sources, the balance often comes from the federal government. And so you'll note that I didn't put the federal government in the previous sort of slide. And this is because the federal government really doesn't have authority over schools. Schools are state enterprises, and the federal government does not have, they don't operate schools. They don't have any law that can direct schools how to do anything. What the federal government does have is money. And so the federal government utilizes its money in two different ways. One, and think of it as sort of a safety net support type funding. So there's significant amounts of money from the federal government to school districts based on the poverty of the students that the school district serves. So this, you might hear it as Title I funding. So schools and school districts are eligible for increased funding to serve students in poverty. Most of that funding comes from the federal government. This is the case also for students with disabilities. And so the federal government provides a sort of ramped up safety net for particularly identified vulnerable student populations, students in poverty, students with disabilities, students for whom English is not a first language, etc. So that's one way in which the federal government provides funds. And in order to receive those funds, you must abide by certain federal laws, like you can't discriminate, and you must do certain things. So think of it as the federal spending power with strings attached. So the federal government can't dictate policy, but they can incentivize policy by making funding available. And that's really the second way in which the federal government uses its funds, and it's to incentivize development in a certain direction. So for example, in the early 2000s, the federal government really wanted to see a growth in the number of charter schools. So what they would do is they would make funds available to school districts or states who would increase the number of charter schools that existed in their particular jurisdiction, whether it's a school district or a state. And so they can't say you must lift your cap on how many charter schools there are in the state, but they can say, if you lift your cap on how many charter schools there are in the state, then we'll make this money available to you. Okay, and so that's the way in which they incentivize policy. Just from a buzzword standpoint, you might have heard of Race to the Top. Race to the Top was a big pot of money that was made available to states and school districts. And Tennessee was the sort of first large recipient of funding under Race to the Top that was made available by the Obama administration, but came with influence on how, in order to be eligible to get the money from Race to the Top, states had to do certain things like lift the cap on the number of charter schools. Somebody mentioned during class the achievement school district. So creating a state turnaround district was one of the sort of strong suggestions in order to be eligible for Race to the Top money. So this is how the federal government plays its role, right? It plays its role by using the money it has to influence policy or to provide this safety net and support vulnerable student populations. But even though it is a significant amount of money, it's spread so broadly that in most places, the federal government's contribution to a school district's budget is 10% or less. So most of the authority and most of the funding is coming from states or local entities, okay? And just, to sort of put the, I think I've already mentioned it, all of that money is coming from taxes. So as you think through this, I've been asking how do certain policies reflect what we think the purpose of education is? We have a largely publicly funded education system. 90% of our students or 85% of our students are in public schools, and those are publicly funded free institutions for K-12. What does that say about what we think the value or the purpose of education is, as we connect it to a public good that we are all paying for? This is just the pie chart that gives a sense of where the money is coming from. So you can see, about half is coming from the State Department, the state, through some version of taxes, maybe 40% or so. This is just a generic chart. I think it's reflective of, schools here in Shelby County, but I think it's generically applicable outside of Shelby County as well. And then the sort of special, so 40% coming from local taxes only, and then a smaller portion coming through grants or incentive programs or safety net type support from the federal government. The one last thing that I want to bring to your attention, and this is where I want to get you guys input on, so this is like a preview of what we'll talk about in class, is one other bit of authority that I haven't discussed and that is a significant topic for us in this course is the determination of how it's determined which students go to which schools. Okay, so broadly speaking, this is student assignment, right? What are the systems, what are the ways in which it's determined which kids go to which schools? Because up here we have hundreds of thousands, millions of families and students, and they all have to figure out which schools they're going to go to, right? And down here we have hundreds of thousands of schools in different school districts, right? We have thousands of school districts and then hundreds of schools in those school districts. We have private schools as an option, religious or non-religious private schools. I didn't put homeschool in here, but that's, a decision point. Or there's charter schools that are, I've got them out here separated from the school districts, but largely, and that's kind of how they operate with significant autonomy. but how do families and students, how is it determined which families and students go to which schools? So how is this line drawn between families and students and schools? So I would like to encourage you to think through the kinds of mechanisms and policies that help us sort out who goes to what school. Student assignment. That's going to be a major topic in the course, and so I want to spend some time talking about that. So hopefully this has not been too much information all at once, and hopefully you guys are able to follow along and come equipped with questions. I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye.